Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the abbreviated online version of the ESIG Tucson Spring Technical Workshop. I'm Charlie Smith, the Executive Director of ESIG, and I'll provide a few brief opening remarks. As you know, we had to cancel the physical meeting due to the coronavirus situation, and after consultation with our session chairs, we decided to proceed with a shortened online version. So we're holding webinars for the 2 plenary and the 10 technical sessions beginning in mid-March, running through early May, approximately twice a week. You can find the full schedule at www.esig.energy under the Events tab. Recognizing the limitations of a webinar with more than 100 people on the line, we will have individual presentations of 10 minutes or so, followed by 5 minutes of discussion, moderated by the session chair. The lines will be muted, so we ask you to use the question box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and not the chat box. I repeat, not the chat box. Today, we'll be hosting the opening plenary session, Thinking About the Value of DER, which is chaired by Matt Schuerger, Commissioner with the Minnesota PUC. Matt has a long history in the electric power business and is active in NERC. He recently sponsored a resolution for adoption of the revised IEEE Standard 1547 for the interconnection of DER by the states nationwide. Matt is also a member of the ESIG Advisory Council and a good friend. Matt, I will now turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Charlie, and welcome everybody to this this online session of thinking of the value of DER. I'm really pleased with the lineup of speakers we have this afternoon. We have 5 terrific presentations. We're going to start with a utility perspective on value of DERs, move then to a customer perspective, and then a regulatory perspective, and then we'll wrap up with a couple from the bulk electric system perspectives, some thoughts from NERC and from the New York ISO. So first up this afternoon, to share with us a utility perspective on the value of DER is Obadiah Bartholomy. Obadiah is the manager of the Distributed Energy Strategy at Sacramento Municipal Utility District. His team is responsible for developing enterprise strategy for electric vehicles, building decarbonization, distributed solar and storage, and load flexibility. Obadiah has worked in research and strategy roles at SMUD for the last 17 years, focusing on climate policy and strategy, solar, and DERs. And with that, Obadiah, I'll turn it over to you, and I just remind folks to, if you're thinking of questions during Obadiah's presentation, as Charlie outlined, please put those in the question box in the lower right of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can when Obadiah finishes up. Go ahead, Obadiah, it's all yours.
Great, thanks, Matt, and welcome everyone. Appreciate the opportunity to share some perspectives from SMUD with all of you. So I'll just jump right in on this. By way of some context, in 2019, SMUD adopted an integrated resource plan that set a goal of net zero carbon by 2040, with really significant local investments in electrification of transport and building sectors as a means to help offset some of the remaining grid emissions we expect to have for reliability purposes in 2040. We're expecting to invest nearly $2 billion in electrification of these other sectors over this time, as well as nearly $1 billion in local storage to enable us to integrate these significant amounts of variable renewables we're anticipating with this plan, reducing overall Sacramento emissions below 1990 levels by 2040. As we look to do that, we're expecting really significant increases in DER adoption and expect those to contribute in a significant way to helping us integrate all of that electrification. Anywhere between, depending on the category 3 and 20x increases just over the next 10 years in DER adoption. So this is going to be really critical for us in forecasting this adoption and making sure we've got our arms around who's adopting it and where. As we think about valuing distributed resources in the grid planning space, that prediction of adoption is really critical. in order to plan for necessary grid upgrades and make sure we're not either overbuilding our system and resulting in potentially stranded assets, or which could create unwelcome rate impacts and deter electrification, but at the same time that we're not underbuilding our system and slowing down that process of electrification, in particular something about DC fast charging and medium heavy duty vehicle applications. So doing this well really requires accurate spatial and temporal confidence, and we're working on a tool with Clean Power Research called the Watt Plan Grid to enable us to do that using individual customer choice of DERs under different rate scenarios, technology cost scenarios, and leveraging our more than a decade experience of customer adoption of DER technologies and mapping that to customer segmentation information, both demographic and psychographic. So that's really how we're expecting to hone our confidence intervals around DER adoption at the feeder level and beyond. Some of the categories of capacity deferral I was going to just touch on today. The first and probably most commonly understood is the specified capacity avoidance or non-wires alternatives, as these are commonly thought of, where DERs are procured to displace a specific distribution investment. Typically, these are done closest to the distribution planning, or close into the distribution planning process timeline, which can create some complexity and time constraints around deploying these projects and make it challenging sometimes to think about scaling these beyond the pilot scale.
Obadiah, can I interrupt you for just a moment?
Sure.
The quality of the audio is kind of, I don't know if it's a matter of headset or the distance from the microphone, but maybe try to speak a little bit closer to the microphone.
Okay, I'll try. It's a bit of a fixed headset, but I'll see if this is any better.
Yeah, I think it is.
Okay.
Thank you.
The second category that we think about is this unspecified capacity avoidance, where you have organic DER adoption that reduces demand ahead of a distribution planning process. In this case, you avoid a capacity upgrade being triggered, and it's very low cost. You're leveraging that organic adoption. It's not complicated for the utility, but it can be complicated to attribute value to the DER and to actually go back and go through but-for case of what the distribution planning and investment cost would have been but for these investments. Typically, that's not currently done by utilities. This last area is a way to think about maybe bridging some of the gaps between specified and unspecified as we're thinking about it. That's the creation of sort of a DER planning threshold that would be set ahead of a distribution planning process threshold and could trigger something like a modest locational benefit adder or just create visibility to the role of DERs in deferring asset investment. So I'll just step through an example of each of those very quickly. This is kind of the traditional process where load growth exceeds capacity planning threshold, in this case a 90% threshold, such as might be seen on a distribution substation. If switching as a lower no-cost approach is not available as an option to avoid a capacity investment, then a capacity expansion is built, resulting in overcapacity for some period of time as load ticks up towards the next capacity planning threshold level, and creating that stranded asset risk that I mentioned if load eventually levelizes well below that level. Specified avoidance is where are engaged to defer a capacity upgrade, and so far this has involved utility procurements and special attention being placed, which so far has not been demonstrated to be scalable beyond the pilot level. Here's an example of organic DER adoption avoiding ever reaching the planning threshold, and as I mentioned, the challenges with attributing value in this are many. Currently, we don't even apply distribution planning staff time to looking at what would have happened but for the DERs and think about what we might have switched or what we might have invested in would require significant change to how we do things today. And here's an example of the planning threshold we're considering. This would be something that would be different depending on the rate of change of load growth, and could involve a modest incentive, or could just be creating visibility to the role of DERs in that kind of unspecified deferral space. Could also give a little bit more lead time to engage some lower cost organic adoption approaches to avoid future specified deferral requirements. Shifting now to thinking about operational considerations for value of DERs, we kind of think of these in two categories. The fixed category being predominantly solar PV and energy efficiency, which have a pretty fixed or predictable shape. They're not really affected by pricing or direct signaling. And then the set of dynamic distributed resources being battery storage, electric vehicles, HVAC, water heating, that all can be rate responsive or directly controlled. And each have kind of a range of value. If you have kind of the passive situation where a customer is responding to a retail rate, that's kind of the lowest value that we look at. Active being more of an event-based signaling, something like critical peak pricing or even dynamic pricing might fall into that middle value range, where you're not assured of the customer response, but you've got some ability to predict it over time. And then the highest value being direct control, which would be better able to capture stacked value and maximize the value both to the customer and the utility. Obvious trade-offs here are in the cost of accessing direct control. That can be higher cost both due to communications and what the customer needs to be compensated to give up that level of control of their device. Here's just an example of how we've looked at that for a battery storage program, showing a range of value to the customer along the x-axis and a range of value to the utility along the y-axis for full customer dispatch. In this case, we saw over $68 of value to the customer net, but a loss of $75 to the utility. That was under a full customer dispatch. Under full direct utility dispatch, we were able to achieve a $25 net value to the utility and still a $65 or $62 net value to the customer. And obviously looking at a range of shared use combinations between the two to see where we should design a program. Briefly, we have been in dialogue with the solar and storage industry quite a bit over the last year, recognizing that our retail rate structure is not ideal currently with full net metering to maximize shared value with our solar and storage customers and the rest of our customers. Right now we have about 30,000 solar customers that are on about 10% of our single-family houses that have solar, which we estimate is causing about a $30 million per year shift in fixed cost recovery to customers that don't have access to solar. And so we've engaged a consultant to help us with a value of solar and value of solar plus storage study to really value the different bins of generation, transmission, distribution, environmental and societal impacts of both behind the meter solar and storage. And are expecting this study to be done this summer. We're going to be evaluating both customer dispatched and utility dispatched values. So that should be interesting to see kind of what we can get under both just a strictly rate-based or programmatic based approach from a value standpoint. That's going to be followed by a series of workshops before a rate proposal in 2020. To just circle back to our IRP and the carbon focus that we've got there, what we've been shifting towards in terms of thinking about value of DERs is really thinking about those in the context of what it costs us to reduce carbon from the different categories of investment. And we've actually adopted a carbon metric for energy efficiency and electrification. That was adopted by our board here in 2020 and is now guiding our overall efficiency portfolio, which traditionally was on a 1.5% of retail sales target per year. We're now using this lifetime carbon metric that accounts for transitions in the grid carbon over time to really prioritize where we invest our dollars. And we've done this with an hourly approach, looking out at the grid transition of the next 20 years, matching load shapes of energy efficiency, building electrification, EV, and solar. We'll be adding storage and load shifting to that. So that's really just in terms of where we're looking to go in the future. Thinking about these in terms of the carbon cost effectiveness is really the key, and making sure that we're getting the right shared value between customers and the utility. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Obadiah. Terrific presentation. Again, to attendees, I would encourage you to, if you have questions for Obadiah, to enter them in the question box. We did have a question come in, Obadiah, on the net metering cost shift. And the question, Obadiah, is you say the cost shift is $30 million per year for 30,000 customers, so $1,000 per customers per year, the questioner was asking, and is that correct? And can you give a little more background on that?
Sure, yeah, that does work out to be correct, although about half of our capacity is in the commercial sector versus the residential, so equating it on a per customer per year basis might be a little challenging to think about just like as a residential customer bill. And that analysis was done by our pricing team, looking at our marginal cost study and looking at the energy value as well as the local transmission capacity value associated with the solar PV shape.
Great, that's helpful. Could you talk about a little bit about what specific changes you're anticipating to retail rates?
I think one of the things that we have to balance with retail rates is customer complexity, and so that's been a constant tension of wanting to get more towards dynamic rates, but needing to make this simple for our customers. We recently rolled out a default time of day rate last summer that involves about a 3-to-1 super peak to off peak ratio, and we've also got about a $20 per month customer fixed charge. I think we were pretty pleased with the time of day rate result. We got about a 3% low drop from that last summer. So that was pretty exciting to see. And we've got only about a 2% opt out. I think the next component we're talking about is some sort of super off peak that addresses the solar overgeneration issue that we're expecting to continue to expand in the West. But again, managing that customer complexity is going to be key, and making sure they have technology that can respond to the rates automatically is also pretty critical.
Great, thank you. Obadiah, for the dynamic DERs, how are you thinking about forecasting, scheduling, and dispatching those resources?
So right now we are in our phase 2 of our DERMS implementation. So we're starting now to connect customer programs into that DERMS. And I think we're going to have a combination of aggregator-based forecasting as well as forecasting within the DERMS to see what expected response will be to different dynamic pricing streams that are sent directly to devices versus direct-to-control signals. We've got a pretty extensive history of measuring thermostat-based response under different schemes, but applying that now to battery storage and water heating is really, as well as EV managed charging, is really where our focus is going.
Great. And I think that we have time for probably one more question here. Obadiah, for the carbon benefit, when you're looking at the carbon benefit of electric vehicles, is that based on the current grid resource mix or on an assumed future or primary, or an assumed future of primarily renewable energy?
So we aligned the carbon profiles from our integrated resource plan, which looked out over 20 years of changes in the grid resource mix, and those values I was showing were for the current snapshot of an EV that's adopted today and would be expected to be on the grid for the next 10 years. So it's accounting for the carbon change through time and the expected time of day of consumption of that vehicle and the carbon emissions at that time of day on our grid.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I think that we're at time now on your presentation. I'd ask everybody to give Obadiah a virtual round for a great presentation. I'd like to move on to our next presentation, which is from the customer perspective. And next up will be Holly Ladd. Holly is the Energy Program Manager at Target Corporation, where she analyzes utility rates, regulatory policy, and emerging energy trends to advance Target's clean energy goals across the country. Holly's gained experience in clean energy rate design and policy development through her prior work directing the Energy Markets Program at the nonprofit Fresh Energy, as well as a utility rate analyst with the Minnesota Department of Commerce. Holly, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me here today. I've been asked to talk about how, as an end-use customer hosting distributed energy resources, how we look at the value streams that the customer can receive from these investments, and how we see those changing from maybe a few years ago to now, and kind of looking into the future from the customer perspective. I think fundamentally, what I'll say is, if you look at this picture and you visually subtract the solar panels from your mind, you see it's a large roof not doing much, meaning it's not producing value for this particular store. And that's fundamentally why Target has been very interested in behind-the-meter solar applications, which would be the main focus of my discussion today. It's another way to generate value from an existing asset, meaning a large flat roof that otherwise wasn't doing much for itself. So we are fortunate to have that resource in our stores across the country. And we are an energy user from when the stores open at 7 a.m., when they close typically at 11 p.m., and then over the evening with refrigeration load. So we have both the energy load to use much of the solar resource truly behind the meter, and then we have the hosting resource for it. And that's why I think, as you'll see in a few slides, Target and many of our other peers are stepping up in the space and doing what we can. So with that, I first want to talk a little bit about some of the industry trends with other primarily retailers and other corporates doing on-site solar investment. If you're interested in learning more about these trends, I highly encourage you to look at SEIA's annual report, Solar Means Business. They've been putting out a report for many years now, collecting data from large corporate solar installers around the country on the megawatts of installed nameplate capacity being invested in by year, and then where those projects are. So they have a great report and an interactive website. This data I'm showing is from their last report, which covers the calendar year 2018. And of course, I picked it because Target is number one in this chart, where we had 229 megawatts of DC nameplate solar capacity, followed closely by Walmart and Prologis, which is a real estate company. There's a lot of growth in this area, and I think it's interesting particularly to see which years many of these companies started their investment in solar, and then how those may have changed over time. And that kind of gets into my next slide. This is, in thinking about this presentation I was asked to do, I try to break down the different value streams that we look at both financially or for non-direct financial benefits, and how those may have changed from just a few years ago in this industry to what they kind of look like now in the future. So the primary value for customers, end-use customers like Target, would be the avoided energy cost. And energy costs here being KWH-based charges that are billed by the retail utility. Net metering is definitely a strong part of that value stream, depending particularly on the load shape of the customer. That has been changing a lot. It's still the primary value stream, I would say, about the avoided energy. But as Obadiah talked about, changes in retail rate design, decreasing particularly wholesale energy prices on a KWH basis are really changing this construct. And it can be difficult for customers who are investing in their own capital in many cases in upfront project financing to think about the position they're taking on these future changes that are largely out of their control, particularly since many end-use customers' energy is not their core business. So they need to really study up on that. Demand charges are a large part of commercial and industrial customer utility bills, and solar may help reduce those charges depending on the rate design of demand charge cost recovery, as well as the shape of the solar and coincidence to the customer's load. This was always very dependent on the unique situation, and the NREL has actually done some great studies on the features that result in large savings on this component to customers, which customers are in the best shape to see that, schools with their load shape being one of them, and which ones are less likely to see that cost savings. Demand charges are also undergoing significant changes in the industry. Many states, there's a generation coincident demand charge to recover generation capacity charges versus distribution. On California, many of the investor and utilities have 3 different demand charges customers are trying to manage around. So this is also can be very load dependent and changes as the system peak moves later in the evening. Renewable energy credits are a big value stream customers are often looking for, either to claim them for their own voluntary goal reporting or to monetize. So in the past, this was readily assumed that customers would get these renewable energy credits under most all state net metering programs. And that hasn't significantly changed, but particularly in states with more transparent SREC trading markets, this value can change dramatically if you're trying to monetize that value over the 15-year term of the agreement. And customers may not be able to get a long-term forward agreement, particularly in states where the RPS rules are changing. So we've seen that particularly, I would say, in the northeastern states. Resiliency is a big topic for customers. Like other retailers, we have lived through the California PSPS events last year and now in a different type of critical situation, thinking about our role as resiliency centers in the community. Behind the meter solar, even a few years ago, there was discussion about how that could be a value for resiliency, but I would say, at least from our perspective, it wasn't a key planning consideration. But now it's definitely something we're looking at, along with utility level interconnection policies on islanding, disconnect switches, etc. And so that's definitely something we're evaluating. The rise of commercial scale energy storage has helped in that, but the financials for that scale of commercial energy storage are still challenging, high level, I would say. On the cost drivers that you were weighing those other value propositions against, panel costs used to be a lot more significant part of the overall installed system cost, but those have seen significant declines, as many of you are well aware. And so that has been a positive. I think we'll continue to see low panel costs in the future, despite a lot of uncertainty in the sector and supply constraints and tariffs and whatnot. The soft costs while they have decreased since the early years of behind-the-meter commercial scale solar, it's the largest part of the installed solar costs. And so while some of the technology improvements have reduced some costs, on average, we are not seeing as an end-use customer those soft costs declining at nearly the rate as the hard panel costs. Obadiah talked a little bit about network upgrades for DERs. As a customer side, we never really saw these upgrade costs as a result of the system sizes Target was installing even a few years ago, around 500 kW. I think as those system sizes have increased, as well as increasing DR penetration, we're increasingly encountering large interconnection upgrade costs as a requirement to interconnect. It has killed projects for us that we've tried to do. And as an end-use customer, we have very little visibility into how those costs are assessed and allocated and what they're really paying for compared to, for example, how much of the depreciable life was already on that transformer that now is to be upgraded. I think this is kind of an untapped area to get more transparency for all parties involved in these projects and on the distribution level, so the cost allocation can truly be fair on the system benefits that upgrade is providing. And then finally, the investment tax credit has obviously been a large driver of this development sector, obviously on the residential but and the commercial scale too. And the commercial ITC is still available. I believe it's 26% this year, down from 30%. But by 2022, that will step down to 10% for commercial projects. So that as that significant tax credit declines, we need to see changes in the other value structures to make up for it. The IRS guidance on how parties may use ITC for solar and storage combined projects has helped. But again, I think storage can be difficult to pencil depending on the commercial customer's load shape. So those are a lot of the value streams, both on the value and the cost that we look at as the end-use customer on deciding to whether or not to install behind-the-meter solar and or storage. And it really creates a funnel for us as we look at all of the sites. Target has over 1,800 stores and distribution centers in all 50 states. We use these macro value streams, if you will, that are in the leftmost box on the screen to help filter those sites. And then there are a lot of location-specific elements that we look at that really make or break the projects. I am an energy person. I am not a structural engineer, but I've learned a lot working with those folks at our company about the different types of roof construction types, the snow load calculations, the age of the roof. All of those things are critical, perhaps like the most critical. Probably should have bolded those and increased the font substantially. You can't underestimate the roofing evaluation. We already talked about interconnection issues. I'll also say on property ownership, it can be difficult with the asset costs, which are nearly 100% upfront, minus some O&M, for companies to make that investment if they're not sure how long they will be at that property. And so some of the retailers lease nearly all of their facilities. Target does lease facilities and some that we own. And so that becomes a key consideration if you compare the term length of the property lease versus the term needed to recover the upfront investment. So after all those filters, I wanted to share a bit about where Target stands in our solar portfolio. So Target has over 500 stores and distribution centers, rooftop solar across the country. The states there in red are the states where we have at least one behind-the-meter solar project, and then the numbers in white there signify how many sites have rooftop solar in that state. And then as you get in the Northeast, those numbers are in black. So we have a lot of coverage, and you can probably see that these aren't so much unexpected trends of where there's a lot of presence. Over half of our stores in California have rooftop solar. We also have a number of those coupled with battery storage. Same thing in Hawaii. And then the Northeast with the access to a lot of the SREC markets at the state level have be able to create another financial stream to make those projects work. Although to be clear, when Target sells the RECs at a given site, which we do through utility programs or in those SREC markets I mentioned around the country, we do not include those in our renewable energy calculations or make public claims about them. We're very mindful of that. We also, I don't have it on this slide, but we have a goal to install EV charging stations at over 100 stores by mid this year. We work with Tesla, ChargePoint, and Electrify America on those, and most of the new goal will be focused on the level 3 DC fast charging. And so we also have a great asset there to help build out that network by large stores where people are willing to spend some time at, often near highway locations. So we are excited to do our part in that area. I have some clip art also on this map, which is to signify where we're investing in off-site renewable energy resources, which I know are not the focus primarily of this conversation, but I wanted to take a minute to say that that is really where I see this industry going for the corporate user perspective. There will always be interest in behind-the-meter DER applications, but to truly get to the scale that we need to get to for our renewable energy and climate goals, we are needing to look off-site, because the typical solar installation on a Target store may produce 30 to 40% of the store's electricity needs on an annual basis, whereas we have a goal to receive 100% renewable electricity by 2030 and reduce our climate change emissions from our own operations and supply chain 30% also by 2030. And supply chain is really where our biggest challenge lies. So that is where I see a lot of this corporate user space going. And my last slide is, and we're not alone in this, where this is a slide from the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, which you can also download online if you then want to be able to zoom in on these very small font company names. But this is a chart showing publicly announced renewable energy power purchase agreements between wind and solar, the combined nameplate capacity announced by companies. So you see in 2019, over 9 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity investment was announced by many Fortune 100s, and Target's proud to be among those. This is where increasingly we are looking at our next frontier and making these investments, and it's also been a way to explore both through the virtual power purchase space, but also in utility green tariff agreements, how we can work directly with our load-serving utilities. I think that's really the end of my slide. That works for you,
Great,
Matt. I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Holly. We have time for a question or two. If people have questions, please feel free to type them into the question box. Holly, you mentioned on one of your slides in your macro environment that one of the criteria was third-party power purchase agreement laws. Can you comment just generally on whether you have a preference of whether you build and own projects yourself, or whether you partner with a third party or partner with a utility? Is there kind of a general philosophy from Target, and what would be the rationale for that?
Yeah, great question. We have done all three of those types of deal structures in the past, and our position is we'd love to have most options as possible, that we can pick the one that works best for that property. So, for example, the third-party power purchase agreements, there's the benefit of not having to put upfront capital in there, which, depending on what is happening at a company, may be scarce. I know some other corporations in a similar field, some of them simply don't own the systems and they only do third-party PPAs because they use all their capital for more business critical investments or investments core to their business, which would not include rooftop solar for them. So we have owned systems, and particularly as you get into leased facilities, the potentially high termination costs on PPAs for early termination may lead some companies to make those investments themselves with their own capital. It really varies by site. So it is something that we do look at of what our financing options are if a site is viable for other reasons. But I'm talking to my peers, I believe this is a bigger barrier for some companies than others.
Yeah, great. And then just two quick final questions before we need to move on. And I'll give them to you both. You can answer them together, or one after the other. Is there an interest, Holly, in solar parking lot cover, shade, rain, etc., from the solar installation? And then the second question is, how does Target plan to charge for EVs? Is there a thought of free EV charging, or will it be third party, or what are the thoughts there?
Sure. So on the solar carports or canopies, it is something we are interested in looking at. We've continued to explore it. We have not done one of those installations, but I know others retailers have. My understanding is that sometimes the barriers are really the high price of steel for the infrastructure to mount the panels can make those prohibitive. But it's something we're continuing to look at and thinking about that shade value and how to put that in the analysis. On the EV charging, yes, this is a big question for us. When we work, the installations we're doing on high speed, the DC fast chargers, those are separately metered, and our third-party vendors pay those electricity bills and have their charging systems for users. So if you have a charge point plan or Electrify America, it would be their rate structures. But I do think this is a real issue for the industry to think about, and I know some utilities like Southern California Edison has done some work on graduated demand charge or different way to think about demand charges in EV charging. Because if, for example, if we did put this behind our meter and you had 3-4 Teslas pull up at the same time and charge, that would rival the monthly peak demand charge for the entire store. And you can't really control when users decide they want to charge, absent the price signals. And so I think this is an area that just needs to continue to get more sophisticated. I know there's a lot of discussions on it, but it is something we think about. At the same time, from a EV host perspective, I will say this is not our core business, and there's EV companies that do it very well. And so that's my message to listeners is to think if this is not your core competency of your business, how can you simplify it to make this value streams easier to comprehend for host facilities to be able to build this out faster.
Great. Thanks so much, Holly. We've got a few more questions coming in, but I'd like to make sure we have time to get to all our presenters. So we'll wrap with you there, and great job. Thanks much. Shifting to our next presenter, our regulatory perspective, is Carl Linvill. Carl's a principal with the Regulatory Systems Project. He's also the chair of the Western Energy Imbalance Market Governing Body. His previous experience serving as a commissioner and energy advisor to the governor in Nevada and as an academic economist. Carl, I'll turn it over to you, and if you could give us 10 to 12 minutes of presentation, and then we'll take some questions for you also. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to participate today. What I want to provide is how regulators are receiving the pitch of DER value today. It's a complicated question for them to deal with. As we know, regulators always have and continue to start with serving the public interest. Serving the public interest has become more complicated in recent times with the traditional focus on ensuring that electric service was affordable, reliable, and resilient today or for the near term was really the focus of regulation for a long time. And many of the regulatory tools that were developed were based on that frame. But now, as emphasized in the first bullet here, regulators simultaneously need to be thinking about those service attributes today and tomorrow because things are changing so rapidly. The other thing that's changing rapidly is that an increasing number of customers, like Holly's company and like many others, cities even, municipalities, individual customers, have goals of their own that they're trying to meet, like the renewable goals, like the goals that Obadiah talked about at the beginning. So regulators want to be responsive. They want to serve the public, be responsive to what the public is asking for, and of course, incorporate that in a way that it maintains affordable, reliable, resilient service for all customers. So that made things more complicated. And then third, there are public policy mandates, whether it be carbon, renewables, or many other either mandates or directives from state government, where the regulator is now needs to think about, how do I fold in these obligations while at the same time, again, ensuring affordable, reliable, and resilient service for customers today and tomorrow. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. Then I'm going to give some simple examples of where this is already happening, where progress is being made. It's so easy to be frustrated that things aren't happening faster, that the grid capabilities and information systems aren't progressing faster, but we have a lot to learn. So I want to give a few, small success stories and then talk about where we're going from here. So first of all, with respect to facilitating DER value, meeting these traditional regulatory goals, primary consideration for regulators continues to be ensuring fair compensation for DER services on today's grid. We're always pulling ourselves toward the future, as the second bullet indicates, trying to anticipate how DERs can be used more effectively in the future. And of course, by DERs here, I'm thinking of DERs writ large, anywhere from demand response and solar and storage and many other things, electrified resources like buildings or vehicles that become grid interactive. That's going to be here. It's going to be here hopefully quickly, but we have to consider fair compensation for DER services today from the perspective of both the adopters of these technologies as well as for grid customers overall. And then third and finally here, we really want to encourage, and I'm glad today we have a couple of presentations at the end on the connection to the wholesale system, getting to this step of co-optimizing DER use for the grid of today, behind the meter, on the distribution system, and on the bulk system. Holly spoke at some length about how Target is affected by rate design. And of course, there's also the view of how well rate design reflects system conditions and system needs, and how well we can do in optimizing the use of DER so that we can use it where it's best needed and co-optimize these purposes across the system. putting it to its best and highest use. Customer preferences are important in presenting challenges by customers. Sometimes we just think of residential customers when we think of customers, but of course I'm thinking about businesses, I'm thinking about local governments who are increasingly interested in working with their utility and utility commission, and many more. So this is calling on commissions, regulators, to think about how they evolve the venue that they offer to these, maybe somewhat non-traditional stakeholders, or maybe somewhat non-traditional issues that come up in proceedings. So being responsive to stakeholders and being responsive to customer preferences is really challenging regulators to think about how can they convene better and how can they elicit what people want more accurately. And, at the same time, as they're interacting with customers, keeping clear where the grid is now, where it's going, and anticipating the connectivity needs that customers are going to have going forward all come into play now in regulatory proceedings. Of course, it happens at an uneven rate around the country, some places happening sooner than others, but ultimately connectivity is going to be far superior to how it is today. It is necessary for regulators to consider that. Examples of things that we've already talked about, where customers come with preferences that they, where they would like to be able to achieve their goals, and the regulator is challenged to harmonize those with the traditional goals of the system, include projects for resilience, electrification efforts, and of course, preferences of customers for low-emitting resources. And then third and finally, there's an increasing pressure from state legislators and governors to be responsive to policy goals and mandates, and to figure out how to evolve regulation, how to evolve planning processes, both integrated resource planning, distribution planning, procurement, all of these things in light of policy directives. Policy directives that states are experiencing include things like renewable goals, electrification, preference for decentralization, reliability and resilience, and of course, environmental goals. So now let's just provide a few simple examples of where regulators are finding value today. Really interesting one is the value of resilience. An encouraging sign of progress over the last decade has been the many resilience projects that the Department of Defense agencies have undertaken at facilities in the United States and elsewhere to make their facilities more resilient for various sorts of contingencies. These facilities, such as the one depicted here, are up and operating, they're cost effective, and they use solar well. Another, maybe a pedestrian example, but just simply using, just considering what kind of integration of solar one can do on the distribution system as you add solar is illustrated by this cooperative in Minnesota. The specific program that they offered was the combination of offering a panel at a heavily subsidized rate if the customer at the same time accepts a free water heater that complies with the grid integrated water heater program. So helping to self-integrate some of this solar at the very same time that it's being installed. Another example that's can be ramped up with improved technology is just demand response, like this direct control program in Nevada Energy Service Territory. It's described here. And finally, the non-wires alternatives possibility of being able to defer or delay. I guess this was Obadiah's, maybe easy category. We've got an upcoming investment. What can we do to defer or obviate the need for a more expensive investment with a clean portfolio of alternatives? And that's illustrated by the Oakland Clean Energy Initiative, which combined, where there was a collaboration between East Bay Clean Energy and PG&E, by demand response, energy efficiency, and distributed generation to obviate the need for a proposed transmission project in Oakland. Doing AMI deployment well is a really important step that many regulators are still just stepping into. I commend you all to the example of the progress Texas has made recently and the formation of, that's mentioned here in the third bullet of the Smart Meter Texas program. And then finally, in the implementation of 1547-2018 is an outstanding opportunity to expand the value of DER, to take advantage of DER today, as well as to anticipate the use of DER going forward. So those are some quick examples, some successes that are happening, that are disseminating around the country. And how do we look at the next steps? RAP has a publication that came out last year through NREL on capturing value from combinations of DERs. In this study, we have 5 kind of categories of recommendations for regulators to consider: acknowledging metering, communications and data system investment and utilization, smart retail rate design and dynamic pricing, wholesale and distribution system coordination to promote visibility, interoperability, and co-optimization, planning process improvements such as integrated distribution planning, and updating utility programs and procurements to allow for things like third-party participation and competitive opportunities where they might not have existed previously. Fortunately, many states, I commend this website to you, the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center, that provides a regular update on grid modernization activities going on around the country. And you can see the kind of the range of activities that we see broken out here. So thank you very much. And Matt, I turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Carl. And again, I'd encourage people to submit questions if they have them by typing them in the Q&A box in the lower right. First, we have time for a couple questions before moving on to the next presentation. First question up, Carl. Should bulk power transmission planners do more than estimate future DER penetration quantity and location, i.e. indirect accounting? Is there something more that should be done by bulk transmission power planners? And a related question, this person submitting the question notes that they don't see how DERs could qualify as transmission itself for transmission rate, base cost recovery, direct incorporation, but wonder about your thoughts on that.
Well, I think beyond, so your first question, I think, was should RTOs be looking at more than just forecasting DER penetration? Is that right?
Yeah, and bulk power transmission planners generally, but including RTOs. Well,
the thing that leads to mind most directly on that is considering whether the avenues are being made for enabling aggregated distributed energy resources to offer services that are meaningful on the bulk system. I agree that individual distributed energy resources are too small to impact needs on the bulk system, but working towards enabling aggregation of those resources so that they can potentially qualify, I think is really important. Working with public utility commissions and utilities to develop, greater visibility back and forth on how resources are behaving, so that the grid operator can better anticipate not only how much the resource is providing, but operationally, when is it providing it, and how is it interfacing with the system, I think is an important consideration. And then, finally, enabling the kind of participation rules for aggregated distributed energy resources so that you're prepared. Once the information systems and protocols are available where you can achieve the interoperability between the bulk system and the distribution side of the house, then we're going to need to ensure that there are avenues for those distributed resources and aggregated distributed resources to provide services into the bulk system. So I think all of those are steps that could be taken by the bulk system operator in collaboration with the regulator and the utilities in their footprint to anticipate the meaningful participation of aggregated distributed resources on the bulk system.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more with you, Carl. The question is, do you think that the primary barrier to extracting value from DER is more on the technical side, i.e. the need to implement IEEE 1547? Or do you think that the barrier lies more on the regulatory side, such as changing how utilities recover revenue, relying on volumetric sales? Do you have a sense of that balance between those two?
Well, I think both are important, and I think if we look back at Obadiah's presentation at the beginning, where he was breaking apart, how can DERs contribute? He had some really nice categories that I wrote down. Specified deferral, unspecified deferral, and DER planning thresholds. These are things that the regulators could be considering. I don't think I have actually seen it broken down that nicely in regulatory proceedings. Not that states aren't doing some or all of those things, but I think that working with utilities, I think the pilot project that Obadiah described also is really intriguing, evaluating customer dispatched resources versus utility dispatched solar plus storage resources, and what that reveals about the value of those resources when they're used in different ways. So I think, I think they're, and all of those, both of those things require both investment, technological investment. So there is a technology barrier that needs to be overcome, but it also requires changes in regulations that should start now. We don't need to wait for more investment in technology to anticipate that these capabilities are going to be coming and to pave the way so that they can meaningfully participate.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you for a terrific presentation, Carl. Much appreciated. Next up is Bob Cummings. Give us a perspective from NERC. Bob is the Senior Director of Engineering and Reliability Initiatives at NERC. Bob joined NERC in 1996, has extensive geographically diverse experience in system planning, operations, engineering, and wide area planning. And Bob, I'll turn it over to you. If you could give us 10 to 12 minutes of presentation, then we'll have some time for questions right after your presentation. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Matt. NERC has a very specific mission as described in the Industry Policy Act. That's to ensure the reliability of the North American bulk power system. And to do that, we're going to develop and enforce reliability standards, assess current future reliability, analyze system events and recommend improvements, encourage active participation by all the stakeholders, and we're being held as accountable to regulators of the United States and the Canadian provincial governments. So what does reliability consist of? Basically adequacy. Do we have enough power at any given time? And second, operational reliability, the ability to withstand sudden disturbances like short circuits and loss of system elements. But now we've been faced with a new paradigm. We're changing our basic mix of power. We're retiring coal plants, we're retiring oil plants, and we're installing vast quantities of solar voltaic and other DERs in varying sundry ways. We have rooftop solar, we have very large solar farms, particularly in California, and we have large wind farms and things of that nature. But there are dozens and dozens of other things that are included in the DER world. But the question comes up, is it only the stuff that's connected to the distribution system that we need to be concerned about? Is it distributed energy resources or distribution energy resources? And then we're moving towards a situation where we really do need to consider it as distributed, inclusive of the sub-transmission and lower voltage transmission, because there are some very, very interesting things about it. We've got the variability of output. That's problematic with the supply, but we've got system protection coordination. We're making flows go in the directions they've never designed for. And we have distribution feeder flow balancing, just to name a couple. So why are we interested? We're supposed to be talking about the bulk power system. Why are we interested? Just the penetration is growing at incredible rates. In 2016, we had the Blue Cup fire, and we suddenly realized there was close to 9,000 megawatts of solar out in the deserts of California. And we had some issues there. But it's no longer limited to distribution connected DER. We've got lots of solar and wind coming in above that, especially outside of California, on the 46 kV system, 69 kV system, and lower voltage transmission systems that are not part of the bulk electric system. The other thing we've got coming at us, as we were talking just briefly before, is aggregation. The DER management systems, that's supposed to have a DE in it, but I can't type all the time. We've got several types of resources. If you think, most of them are all connected by inverters. And then we have other controllable load components and the concept of virtual power plants. Often all of this stuff is not directly visible or under the control of the system operators. And real basic to everything, there's an incredible lack of data for planning and operating the grid. Somebody asked, what should the transmission planners be doing? A, collect data. Learn how to model this stuff. We've done a number of studies related to the inverter-based resource world where we had some fires and simple, normally cleared transmission faults, and they cause very large loss of the inverter-based resources. So they're out on our website. One of them was the Blue Cup fire. Then we had a number of others here, and we've issued alerts about stuff, about what to fix. Part of the things with system frequency during IBR-related disturbance, the rate of change of frequency that you can see in these two graphs is very, very sharp compared to even just the loss of a normal power plant. Part of that was included because inverters tend to do a thing called momentary cessation, which means they just turn off. And that is very quick and very very disturbing to the system. But we've recently started, at the tail end of these analyses, we've started seeing the rooftop solars getting into the act. So here are two particular times when we had the load jump indicating that they had inverters trip on the distribution system. So that becomes disconcerting. We are now facing a situation where we not only have to consider what's utility grade inverter-based resources, but also the stuff on the rooftops. And why are we concerned? Well, there are hundreds of thousands of these things. Looking at the long-term reliability assessment from 2018, we're looking and expecting at least 30 gigawatts of new distributed PV by the end of 2023. This is 2-year-old data, so you know this number has grown. So some of the integrating challenges, several mandates for our states and governments about higher penetrations of renewables. Well, what is higher penetration? You're displacing fossil fuels, mostly synchronous generators, and lower operating reserves are possible, but they're not something that's going to happen by themselves. Some of the present challenges are extremely high ramp rates, as we've seen in California, and most of the renewables, a lot of the renewables, their output is often weather dependent. But they are wonderful devices. They can do all sorts of things, particularly fast frequency response, which we're going to need to combat the loss of inertia on the system for system frequency. And if we do it right and not depend on fossil fuels to create that fast frequency response, do it by curtailing some of this solar and wind and using that curtailed resource as the vehicle for doing zero carbon footprint response. So what is penetration? Everybody talks about penetration. People say, I've got 70% penetration today. I've got 40%, 25%. A lot of times what they're talking about is instantaneous, 1 hour or one scan rate. We had this happen in Colorado where they attained a 25% annual energy penetration, but that means at one point in time they had 71% instantaneous penetration. And if you look at this line, the yellow boxes indicate what monthly penetration is. The annual penetration is the green line, but the blue dots are the instantaneous values. So how does that happen? You notice there are an awful lot of penetrations that are very, very low. So coming with that 71% for a 25% annual number, you had these hockey stick curves. So you look at these are extrapolated from actual data. So if you're saying I've got this for a year, if I look at an hour, I've got these very large portions of it where I don't have that high penetration. So it becomes problematic for the system operators to try to track these issues. So other things in operational impacts, you've got generation commitment and dispatch. You get the variability of resources. What do you do with the excess energy? If we're just depending solely on rooftop solar, for instance, and you can't control them, eventually that swimming pool is going to be overfilled and overflowing. And how would you turn them off? You can't. So then we have the other problem of lower system inertia and fault current that I mentioned. And how do you do frequency control and response? On the generator side, you've got generators that never were designed to chase high ramp rates. So they're going to have increased O&M costs from increasing their cycling. Another safety net that's affected by these penetrations is under-frequency load shedding. We thought we got 100 megawatts on that substation, but reality is when we try to trip it, you only get 50. Real-time modeling and tools for state estimation and contingency control the contingency analysis also get to be a problem. On the transmission planning considerations, models. The models we have for this stuff, are really problematic. Power flow and contingency analysis, frequency disturbance planning. What do you do with UFLS? The short circuit assessments, energy and capacity planning, inter-regional transmission planning, very large areas. But what do you do? Where do you model these things? So are there any risks to the BPS? How can we better model it? What level of modeling of detail is needed? Where should DER be modeled? On the distribution, transmission, or both? How do you include them in planning and operations? What level of visibility and control do you have? So enter the world of DERMS, Distributed Energy Resource Management Systems. These are control systems that are essentially the tools for aggregation of the control and amount of energy that's coming out of the DER world. And there are lots of potential impacts for that. But DERMS is probably one of the best vehicles, but it straddles the transmission and distribution system. So the balancing authority, the system operator balancing authority, has the added burden of trying to manage both. And remember, a cardinal rule of operating an electric system, you cannot break the rule of security-constrained economic dispatch. You can't overload systems just because of the economics, because you want to make money. You can't make it a problem. So what other industry standards and guidelines might be needed? So we're collaborating with the industry to determine how characteristics contribute to BPS reliability, quantifying the steady state and dynamic analysis, investigating modeling, and creating a forum and a platform to address the reliability needs across the T&D systems. On distribution, we're collaborated with the development of IEEE Standard 1547, which, by the way, has been adopted as something to be used by the National Association of Regulatory Commissions, NERC. And subtransmission and low voltage transmission, we were also working with IEEE on the standard development for IBR's inverter-based resources connected above the distribution system. So 1547 covers the distribution. This talks about the design standard for the rest of the inverters. And we're participating in the DER management system guideline development. This is a very important document because I think this is going to be needed sooner than later. We also have done some reliability and guidelines and interconnection guidance for BPS-connected inverters, and we've modified our standard PRC-24 for frequency and voltage settings, just trying to get all of this stuff moving in the same directions, like having all four wheels of your car turn in the same direction. It's a good idea. So with that, I can open it up for questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Bob. You covered a lot of really important territory there, and I think we have time for a couple of questions. I wanted to ask a little bit about the, you talked about collaborations and partnerships, which I think is so important in this work, and I know that NERC is prioritizing that. I've always appreciated NERC's interest in partnering and working with the states. You talked a little bit about 1547, but could you just talk briefly about some of the challenges of planning and managing reliability across that TD interface with the change in jurisdictions, and what are key areas of partnership and collaboration going forward to address that? As your NERC is focused clearly on the bulk electric system reliability, is more needed from the states, and if so, how do you see us handling that collaboration?
I think that the collaboration that's embodied in the creation of IEEE's P2800 standard on inverters and understanding of DERMS is going to be key. those are the areas where we got to get the equipment built right so that whatever you buy will have the right bells and whistles on it. And secondly, it behaves, plays well in the sandbox of this power system. So if we collaborate with that and work on our own BES standards, 1547 and P2800, where you have a continuum of like requirements for voltage control and frequency control and response, I think you have the right kind of thing now. There are just tons of other aspects that have to be addressed. Everything from how do you deal with the protection systems being potentially compromised because they no longer have the elements of that they need to protect the system. Everything from that to distribution feeder imbalances and reverse power flow onto the transmission. You've got to be able to have far more distribution observation and control so that you don't overload distribution transformers or create extreme high voltages in spots and things of that nature. But you also have to be able to think about things like, what is a virtual power plant? It can't be a guy aggregating power from a plant in a rooftop solar in Florida and trying to match it up or aggregate it with California. They're in different interconnections. That doesn't work. Similarly, financially you can play that game, but you can't do it in the physical world. Similarly,
Right.
You've got the same thing. You've got the same thing within a state. The state regulation may have two different power companies, two different balancing authorities to deal with, and you got to avoid double accounting, where I'm going to sell it to this BA, and then I'm also going to sell it to that BA, and hedge my bet that I'm not going to need it in both places at the same time. That doesn't work. So the DERMS guideline is going to be very, very important on how to integrate those management systems, both for the transmission and distribution. And that's going to be the real key. And what services can DERMS provide? Voltage control, aggregation for energy only, et cetera, et cetera. Can they control? That's a very important thing. And that leads to the real question of, are they secure? Or can somebody hack in and turn off a whole bunch of the DER just through the DERMS? So.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob. That was a terrific presentation, and appreciate the addition and follow-up information questions. In the interest of time, we'll need to move forward, but again, thank you, Bob, for that great presentation. Our final speaker, last but definitely not least, is James Pigeon of the New York ISO. James has been involved in evaluation, design, implementation, and operation of wholesale electricity markets at the New York Independent System Operator for over 18 years. His tenure at New York ISO includes work in market design, information technology, and project management. And as manager of DER integration, he's currently responsible for integrating distributed energy resources into New York ISO's wholesale electricity markets in support of New York State's strategic public policy objective called Reforming the Energy Vision, or REV. And I'll just note on time, we're running a little late, but James, I would ask that you go ahead and take 10 to 12 minutes to present, and we'll try to get a couple of questions. I hope the bulk of our large audience can stay with us a little bit longer. My apologies for running late, but we should be finished up by about 10 minutes past the scheduled time, or 15 minutes at most. So with that, James, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. So I'll do my best to try and move through it a little bit quicker and see if we can make up some time. So just at a high level, the NYISO's been working on its development of its DER model for roughly the last 5 years, starting shortly after New York State's REV initiative. And what we've really been trying to do is come up with a comprehensive model that would allow DER to participate in wholesale markets much in the same way that the larger central generation does. But while doing that, also making sure that we're doing it, on an economic basis and reliability basis. And so we're looking at it from a technology neutral aspect and just trying to make sure that DER can come and present themselves and offer their services in a way that still provides the most value to the load consumers. So our DER definition is probably in some ways a little different than a lot of the other DER definitions that are out there. And part of that stems from the idea that we're using our DER model to replace some of our existing demand response programs. And we do have some larger DER customers out there. And so working through with our stakeholders, we worked through probably close, maybe 15 to 20 different DER definitions before we finally landed on what you see in front of you right now. And it's really the idea that it's almost anything that's out there, and it doesn't matter what the technology is. And really the limits come down to just that it has no more than 20 megawatts of injection at a particular facility. Anything on the demand side, there is no actual cap on that. And in coming up with this definition, we did struggle. I think in the last presentation, we heard a little bit about, the bulk system versus some of the sub-transmission versus the distribution grid. And we feel that this definition kind of leaves us open, and regardless of where the DER is actually connected, it'll still be a DER, and it can come to the NYISO and participate. And it will hopefully allow for the most flexibility of all of these different types of resources that are out there and yet to come. So just a quick high-level diagram of how we kind of view this at the highest level, that 50,000 foot level. You're really the key player, most likely in a lot of these scenarios, is this aggregator that's sitting in the center, and we're expecting them to be the resource that really handles a lot of the customer communications and dispatching, and turns around and represents that aggregation of those smaller DER either to the NYISO and or the potential DSP that's out there. There is some options though for the DER if they choose to represent themselves, and assuming that they're sufficiently large and willing to do that, there's no issues or prohibitions from doing so. So again, I think we heard a little bit in the last couple of presentations that aggregations are going to be key, and that really has a lot to do with the fact that we're allowing any resource down to essentially 1 kilowatt to be part of an aggregation, and we've set an aggregation minimum threshold of 100 kW, which we feel allows for quite a bit of participation options. And that 100 kW is tied to a particular transmission node. And the key for that is, I think, again, some of what we just heard in the last presentation, we need to have enough visibility on these DER that we're able to see some impact to the transmission system. And a lot of that aggregator role that I was talking about before is going to be controlling all of the DER that are at that transmission node in concert to essentially act as a virtual power plant. So as I mentioned, the aggregations will be modeled at a transmission node, and at that transmission node is where we will calculate the LMP, as most countries used to referring to it as. And it's a very similar concept to the way that a generator bus price is calculated. It's in our case, it's a load node because that's where we model most of these DER and where we'll see them. But it still doesn't play a big impact in how these resources will be aggregated or paid for. It still works out to be the same way that we treat existing generators today. For the last 5 or so years, we've been working with what's known as the Joint Utilities of New York, which are most of the IOUs in the state, and well, it's all of the IOUs. And part of that coordination effort that we've been working through with them is been trying to figure out how we're going to handle these transmission nodes and map them out. Just real quick at a high level, so this transmission node I've been talking about is that focal point for these aggregations. And when you step down a layer lower, you're talking about if this large rectangular box is the aggregation, now you're down to what's essentially a facility level where it's sitting behind a single facility meter. So part of our model was dual participation, and we really felt that a lot of the feedback we were hearing from stakeholders was about all of the value that DER could provide, but to be viable, they would probably have to be participating in both the retail and the wholesale markets. And to the extent that we could leverage them when we needed them, we felt that this model would allow for that flexibility that our stakeholders were requesting. And so what it really hinges on is the idea that if a DER or an aggregator has an aggregation with some outside responsibilities or contractual agreements, whatever it may be, that they just need to get themselves scheduled in the NYISO markets to meet any of those outside obligations. And so what that does is allow the NYISO full visibility whenever those resources are going to be running on the system. Again, any resource is able to dual participate. There's no restrictions. It was something that we worked on as part of the DER effort, but it does apply to any and all resources that may have outside obligations from the NYISO. And the key there too is also that they must be following the dispatch from the NYISO at all times, and that's why they need to get themselves scheduled in the NYISO markets, regardless of whether it's a NYISO obligation or a outside obligation. Just like a regular generator today, the aggregator is responsible to get themselves managed in a way so that any distribution outages are reflected in their bids. And so essentially today, when a generator has an outage for some reason, whether it be a transmission line or the generator having an issue, an aggregator is going to have to do the same thing whenever there's a distribution level issue. Two options we put out there for telemetry. Option one is pretty much the way it works today. Option two is something we put out there based on stakeholder feedback. And the idea was to essentially remove one hop point. If you can envision the DER being below the aggregator box and the DER2 option, you could see that if it was like it was in option one, there would be an extra hop. And so that's why we went out there with a second option for folks. This operational coordination has really been the crux of what we've been working on with the Joint Utilities of New York. And a lot of this is really tied to the idea that the distribution system constantly has events going on, whether it be a car hitting a telephone pole or some other outage issue that happens. There needs to be constant coordination between the aggregator, the utility, and the ISO. And so this timeline just kind of walks through all the different opportunities that the aggregation or aggregator is going to have to essentially work through the dispatch that they receive from the NYISO, validate it with the utility, and then continue to redispatch any resources it may need to still meet their schedule. And to the extent that they can't, then they'll have to take that, call in that D rate that I mentioned previously. Just a high-level timeline. FERC has accepted our proposal now, and so we're working full speed ahead to essentially get to the point where we can turn the key on our DER model by the end of next year. And along the way, in between now and then, there's a few key points, as you can see here, where we start to accept third-party meter service providers, as well as allowing for some alternative communications that are out there. NYISO is doing something very similar to what we're planning to do. We have some new capacity rules that go into play, and there's also the making public the list of transmission nodes that we'll have out there for the aggregations. So with that, if there's questions.
Great. Thank you so much, James. Really interesting development and models in the New York in the New York area. Had a couple of questions come in. Can you just address, this might be a little bit in the weeds, but does New York ISO's DER market design account for load shedding requirements at the distribution level? And if so, how does it do that?
It's kind of indirect or independent of each other. Any existing load shedding could be done either by the ISO or by the utilities. To the extent that it's done at the utility level, they can still call their own programs independent of the NYISO. They do coordinate with us just to at least let us know that they're calling it. What our hope is that resources will be sensitive to prices and avoid that issue altogether. And instead of having to actually force the curtailed load, the resources will be doing it on their own through the markets.
Great. And we had a question come in, James, about the role of the aggregators. And could you talk a little bit about maybe the need or value of aggregators? The person who asked the questions notes that much of the flexibility we can access may or may not be cost effective if we impose the requirement for an aggregator. So can you just talk a little bit how you view the role of and value of aggregators in your New York ISO model?
Sure. So I'll start by saying that the aggregator is not required. There is no requirement. Any resource that's at least 100 kW on their own could come to the NYISO and participate in one fashion or another. The aggregator is really meant to have that third-party entity that can provide the smarts, if you will, to handle the dispatch of all of the various resources that make up the aggregation. They're also there to handle all of those, business-to-business interactions. They're going to be going out there signing up the customers that are looking to do this. We're expecting a lot of our existing demand response aggregators that we already have in our markets today to shift over to this, and a lot of that's just based on the feedback that we've heard from them.
Oh, great. And then just one final question before we wrap up. How does this dual participation model that you described overlap with the value of DER compensation approach? Could a DER system that receives value of DER compensation also sell energy to the wholesale market?
So we have no prohibitions from our side. As long as they're getting themselves scheduled in our markets and they are following our dispatch, we're going to pay them at the wholesale level. I think from a utility level, if they are getting VEDR, I think that's something that'll be evaluated on a utility basis based on their tariff that they have filed with a PSC. Great.
Thanks so much, James. And thanks, I really appreciate the terrific presentation and question response. I think it's time to wrap up. My apologies, we're a few minutes over, but I'd like to thank all of the panelists for their presentations today and thank all of you attending for your participation. I'd like to remind you that the next Tucson webinar, which will be on session 1, Evolving Thinking on Resource Adequacy for High Variable Generation Scenarios, will be held next Tuesday at 4 p.m. Eastern. You can find the full schedule for upcoming sessions on the ESIG website, www.esig.energy. Thanks again for your participation, everyone. Be healthy, be well. We hope to see you for the next session. We're adjourned. Thank you.